The boy's small hand gripped Cassidy Brennan's dusty riding coat with desperate strength, tears streaking his dirt-smeared face as he pleaded for her to check the barn. When she pushed open those heavy wooden doors expecting livestock, she found his sister hanging from the rafters by her wrists, barely conscious, and 3 men, turning toward her with expressions that promised violence. Cassidy's hand dropped to the worn grip of her Colt revolver as the 3 men spread out like wolves circling prey, their boots scraping against the dusty barn floor in a choreographed movement that spoke of practiced violence. The young woman hanging from the rafters stirred weakly at the sound of voices, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope that had cut deep enough to leave dark stains running down her forearms, and her dress hung in tatters that told the story of hours of brutal interrogation. The leader stepped forward into a shaft of afternoon light that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards, revealing a face marked by a jagged scar running from temple to jaw, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. "Well now," he drawled, his voice carrying the false pleasantness of a snake oil salesman, "looks like we got ourselves an unexpected visitor." The man to Cassidy's left shifted his weight, hand hovering near the pistol at his hip, while the one on her right moved to block the wide barn doors through which she had entered moments before. The air hung thick with the mingled smells of old hay, horse sweat, and the copper tang of fresh blood that made Cassidy's stomach tighten with fury she forced herself to contain. "You must be Dutch Carmichael," Cassidy said evenly, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart against her ribs, because only a coward who hides behind the Carmichael name would string up a woman barely old enough to be called such. Dutch's smile widened, but never reached those dead eyes, and he took another step closer until Cassidy could see the tobacco stains on his teeth and smell the whiskey on his breath. "You walked into the wrong place at the wrong time, miss," he said softly, "and that makes you a problem that needs solving." A small sound from behind made Cassidy's blood run cold, and she risked a glance over her shoulder to see Tommy standing in the doorway, his small face pale beneath the dirt and tears, his hands clenched into fists that shook with either fear or rage or both. "I told you to stay outside," Cassidy said sharply, but the boy's eyes were fixed on his sister hanging limp from the rafters, and she knew wild horses could not have kept him away. Cassidy's mind raced through possibilities as she calculated odds that turned worse with each passing heartbeat. 3 armed men against 1 woman, 2 children who needed protecting, and the nearest rancher hand or neighbour at least 5 miles distant across open country where gunshots would carry but help would not arrive in time. The sister's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, meeting Cassidy's gaze with a desperate plea that needed no words, and in that instant Cassidy made her choice, knowing it would likely be the last decision she ever made. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Cassidy forced herself to stand taller, despite every instinct screaming at her to draw her weapon, and she let a cold smile cross her lips as she met Dutch's gaze, with the kind of contempt that made men like him lose their composure. "What kind of business do 3 grown men have torturing a woman barely out of girlhood?" she asked, her voice carrying across the barn with deliberate loudness meant to remind them they were being witnessed. Dutch's jaw tightened at the challenge, but he seemed almost pleased to have an audience for his grievances, and he gestured towards Sarah with a casual wave that made Cassidy's trigger finger itch. "This here is a matter of collecting what's owed," he said, his tone taking on the righteousness of a man who believed his own justifications. "The girl's father, Henry Walsh, did some surveying work on land that belongs to my associates and discovered something of considerable value, then ran off with maps and documents that represent a substantial investment on our part." Sarah had refused to tell them where her father went or where he hid his findings, which Dutch explained with the patience of a schoolteacher discussing a disappointing student, and that stubbornness had required increasingly persuasive methods of encouragement. Cassidy felt ice form in her veins as she placed the name Carmichael with the stories she had heard in 3 counties, tales of homesteaders driven off their land by forged deeds and intimidation, of claims jumped and witnesses who disappeared before they could testify, of a family operation that had built an empire on theft disguised as legal maneuvering. The Carmichael brothers had avoided prosecution through careful corruption of local officials and strategic violence that left no proof, But everyone knew what they were, even if no court would touch them. So you string up young women when their fathers outsmart you, Cassidy said, letting scorn drip from every word while her eyes tracked the positions of all three men and calculated distances to cover and angles of fire. Above them, Sarah's eyes fluttered open and found Cassidy's face. And in that brief moment of connection, Cassidy saw intelligence and understanding flash between them like a spark jumping across a gap. Dutch took another step forward, his hand moving toward his gun, and Cassidy made a deliberate show of shifting her weight as if preparing to draw, her boots scraping against the floorboards in a way that drew every eye in the barn to her right hand. In that half-second of divided attention, Cassidy pivoted hard on her left foot and kicked out with her right, her worn boot connecting solidly with the base of an oil lantern that sat on a wooden crate near a stack of hay bales that rose nearly to the ceiling, and the lantern toppled with a crash of breaking glass that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Fire erupted from the spilled oil with a whoosh that sucked the air from the barn, and flames raced up the dry hay bales with the hunger of something that had been waiting decades for this moment. Orange light blooming into the shadowed space and turning everything into a hellscape of smoke and chaos. Dutch cursed and stumbled backward as the heat hit him like a physical blow, and in that moment of confusion Cassidy drew her Colt and fired upward at the rope suspending Sarah from the rafters. The crack of the gunshot almost lost in the roar of spreading flames. The rope parted with a snap and Sarah dropped, but Cassidy was already moving, catching the young woman under her arms as she fell and taking the impact with bent knees that sent pain shooting up her spine. Tommy appeared from nowhere with a rusted pitchfork gripped in both small hands, and he drove the tines into the nearest man's thigh with all the force his 9-year-old body could muster. The man howling and grabbing at the wound as blood spread across his pants. Dutch fired wildly through the smoke that was already filling the upper half of the barn, his bullet punching through the wall somewhere to Cassidy's left, and she returned fire while keeping her body between the children and the guns, her shot catching the third man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The side door she had spotted when first entering the barn was only 15 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile with Sarah barely conscious and Tommy frozen in terror at what he had just done. So Cassidy grabbed the boy's collar with her free hand and half-dragged both children toward the rectangle of light that meant escape. Behind them, the flames had reached the loft and were spreading across the ceiling beams with terrifying speed, and chunks of burning hay began falling like hellish rain onto the floor below. They burst through the side door into blessed fresh air, just as a section of roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks, and Cassidy could hear Dutch and his remaining able man shouting to each other through the inferno. She got Sarah across her shoulders in a fireman's carry that made her back scream in protest, and later they ran for the line of tree where she had tied her horse, Tommy keeping pace beside her with his face set in grim determination that looked wrong on someone so young. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames shooting through the roof and black smoke billowing into the clear afternoon sky, and she heard the panicked whinnying of horses as Dutch's mounts broke their tethers and scattered in terror. Her own mare danced nervously, but held steady as Cassidy heaved Sarah across the saddle, then swung up behind her with Tommy scrambling up after, and they kicked into a gallop just as Dutch and one man emerged from the smoke, their faces blackened and their guns drawn but their horses gone, leaving them to shake their fists and fire uselessly at the retreating riders who were already beyond accurate pistol range. They rode hard across open country with the smoke column rising behind them like a marker of their escape, and Cassidy pushed her mare to the edge of endurance until her small ranch house finally came into view nestled in a shallow valley where a creek provided water year-round. Once inside, she laid Sarah on her own bed and brought water from the well, cleaning the rope burns on the young woman's wrists with careful hands that had learned gentleness through necessity rather than nature. The wounds were worse up close, deep grooves where the hemp had cut through skin during hours of suspension, and purple bruises covered Sarah's arms and ribs in patterns that spoke of systematic brutality, designed to break will without causing immediate death. Sarah flinched at every touch and would not meet Cassidy's eyes. Her body curled into itself like something that had learned the world only brought pain, and when Cassidy tried to ask what had happened, the young woman's lips pressed together in stubborn silence. Tommy sat in the corner watching everything with eyes too old for his face, and when the silence became too heavy to bear, he suddenly broke, words tumbling out in a rush that he could no longer contain. "Our pa found silver," he said, his voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion. a whole vein of it running through a land that everyone thought was worthless, or worse, and he made maps showing where it was and how deep it went and everything. He documented the entire claim with the kind of precision that only a trained surveyor could manage, marking boundaries and ore samples and legal descriptions that would stand up in any territorial court. But the land was disputed territory, Toman continued, claimed by 3 different parties with paperwork that contradicted itself, and their father knew that whoever could prove the legitimate claim would control a fortune that could buy half the territory. He disappeared 3 weeks ago, the boy said. His small hands twisting together in his lap, said he was going to the territorial capital to file the proper documents, but told Sarah that if he did not come back in 10 days, she should take Tommy and run. The Carmichael gang had been hunting them ever since, tearing apart their home and questioning their neighbours, and finally resorting to the kind of violence that left Sarah hanging in that barn. Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, admitting that she did not know where their father had gone or whether he was alive or dead, and she had no idea where he might have hidden the maps and documents that Dutch wanted so desperately. Cassidy looked at their faces and saw her own past reflected there, the terror and helplessness of people caught in violence beyond their control, and her mind went to the husband and daughter she had lost 5 years ago to men not unlike Dutch Carmichael, men who took what they wanted and left only grief and graves behind. Sarah finally surrendered to exhausted sleep in the small bedroom, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of someone whose body had reached its absolute limit, while Tommy positioned himself at the front window with the vigilance of a sentry who understood that rest was a luxury they could not all afford at once. Cassidy sat in her worn rocking chair with her Colt across her lap and let her mind drift to places she usually kept locked away behind walls built from necessity and grief, to a time 5 years past when she had been a different woman with a different name and a life that included a husband whose laugh could fill a room and a daughter with dark curls who had just turned 6. The raiders had come in the night like they always did, men who made their living from the suffering of others, and they had killed her husband James when he tried to protect what was his, shot him down in their own doorway, while Cassidy watched from where she had been thrown against the wall. They had taken her daughter Emma, ripped the screaming child from her arms while Cassidy lay bleeding from a head wound that should have killed her, but stubbornly refused to do so. And when she woke hours later to find James cold and Emma gone, something fundamental had broken inside her that could never be properly mended. She had spent 2 years tracking those men across 3 territories, learning to shoot with accuracy that came from endless practice and determination born of rage, learning to ride like someone who never needed to stop, learning to survive alone in country that killed the weak and unwary without mercy or hesitation. She had picked up their trail in mining camps and cattle towns, following rumours and scattered reports like breadcrumbs that led always to the next place and the next disappointment, finding men who had ridden with the raiders and beating information from them, with hands that had once been gentle but learned cruelty from necessity. She never found Emma, never found even a confirmed report of what had happened to her daughter after that night. And as eventually the trail went cold in a way that suggested the child had either died or been sold so far beyond reach that no amount of searching would ever bring her back. The experience had hardened Cassidy into something sharp and dangerous, a woman who kept everyone at arm's length because letting people close meant giving them the power to hurt you, and she had sworn after abandoning the search that she would never again care enough about another person to feel that kind of pain. But now, watching Tommy's small silhouette against the window and hearing Sarah's troubled breathing from the next room, Cassidy felt something stirring in the dead place where her heart used to be, that fierce, protective instinct that had defined her as a mother awakening despite all her efforts to keep it buried. She realized with a mixture of terror and resignation that she could not turn these children away, could not hand them over to whatever fate awaited them beyond her walls, even though protecting them meant putting herself back into the kind of danger she had spent 3 years avoiding. Morning light crept through the window and found Cassidy already awake, with her eyes fixed on the horizon, where dust rose in a telltale line that spoke of multiple riders moving with purpose across the grassland. She counted at least 6 distinct columns, maybe more, and her stomach tightened as she realized Dutch had not only survived the barn fire, but had brought reinforcements to turn a personal vendetta into a systematic hunt. The riders were moving in a pattern she recognized from her own tracking days, spreading out to check every homestead and hiding place within a 20-mile radius, and at their current pace they would reach her ranch by afternoon at the latest. Sarah stirred in the bedroom and emerged looking pale but steadier, the rest having done her more good than Cassidy had dared hope, and when Cassidy showed her the approaching riders, The young woman's face hardened with a determination that replaced the broken terror of yesterday. "My father said something before he left," Sarah said quietly, her voice gaining strength as the memory returned. "Something I did not understand at the time, but makes sense now. He told Sarah that if anything happened to him, she should look where they first struck water, that everything she needed would be waiting there in the place where their family truly began." Tommy overheard this, and his eyes went wide with sudden understanding, his small voice cutting through the tension to announce that their old homestead had an abandoned well, the first well their father had ever dug when he claimed the original land 15 years ago before they moved to the better property near town. If the maps and documents were hidden there, Cassidy realised, they would have something more valuable than their own lives to bargain with. Proof that could bring the territorial marshal down on the Carmichaels with the full weight of law behind him, or at minimum leverage to negotiate safe passage out of the territory. But reaching the old Walsh homestead meant crossing 12 miles of open country with minimal cover, exposed to anyone watching for movement, and with Dutch's men already conducting their sweep, it was only a matter of time before someone checked that abandoned property. Cassidy made her decision with the kind of clarity that came from having nothing left to lose, and she pulled her spare revolver from the locked chest under her bed, a lighter weapon that would fit Sarah's smaller hands better than the heavy Colt. She spent the next hour teaching Sarah the basics of shooting, how to sight down the barrel, and squeeze rather than pull the trigger, how to account for the weapon's kick and reload quickly under stress, while Tommy watched with eyes that took in every detail, as if memorizing instructions for his own future survival. The sound of an approaching horse brought Cassidy to the window with her gun drawn. But she relaxed slightly when she recognized the rider as May Thornton, a weathered cattle rancher of 60 years who ran the largest spread in the county with an iron will that had outlasted 2 husbands and countless challenges from men who thought a woman had no business controlling that much land. May sat tall in her saddle despite the years carved into her sun-darkened face, and her eyes swept across Cassidy's property with the assessing gaze of someone who missed nothing and forgot even less. The history between them was uncomfortable at best, built on an accusation May had made 3 years ago when some of her cattle went missing, words spoken in anger that blamed Cassidy for theft she had never committed. And though the real rustlers were eventually caught 2 counties over, the apology May offered had been grudging enough that both women had simply avoided each other since. Cassidy stepped onto the porch with her hand still near her weapon, uncertain whether May's arrival meant help or another complication in a situation already spiralling beyond control. May dismounted with the stiff movements of someone whose joints protested, but whose pride refused to acknowledge weakness, and her gaze moved past Cassidy to where Sarah stood in the doorway with Tommy pressed against her side, both children looking exhausted and terrified in ways that could not be hidden or explained away. "I saw the smoke yesterday coming from this direction," May said without preamble, her voice carrying the rasp of decades spent shouting orders across open range. "Came to check if you needed help with a grass fire. But I can see you got troubles of a different sort." Her eyes fixed on the distant riders still visible on the horizon, and her jaw tightened with recognition. That looks like Dutch Carmichael's hunting pattern, and men like him do not ride in numbers unless they are after something worth killing for. Cassidy felt her defences rise against accepting help from someone who had once thought so little of her character. But before she could speak, May's attention returned to the children, and something shifted in her weathered features, a softening that spoke of old pain never fully healed. May had lost her own grandchildren to scarlet fever 7 years past, 3 small graves on a hillside that she visited every Sunday without fail, and Cassidy suddenly understood that whatever grudges lay between them mattered less than the lives of 2 young people who had no part in adult failures and pride. "My ranch is 15 miles west," May said, her tone brooking no argument. "I will spread word through every homestead between here and there that I saw you riding north toward the mining camps at dawn. Give those hunters something to chase while you do what needs doing." She looked directly at Cassidy then, and her eyes held an offer of redemption that worked both ways. "I was wrong about you 3 years ago, and I have been too stubborn to say it proper until now. But children should not pay for the mistakes of their elders or the sins of men like Carmichael. They rode hard through the back trails May had sketched out in the dirt. Routes that wound through dense pine forests and followed creek beds, where the sound of water would mask their passage from anyone tracking by ear alone." Sarah sat behind Cassidy on the mare, while Tommy rode double on the spare horse May had provided, and the rhythm of hard travel gradually loosened tongues that had been too frightened or exhausted for proper conversation before. Sarah spoke haltingly at first about her father Henry Walsh, describing him as a gentleman more comfortable with mathematics and surveying instruments than with the rough company of mining camps and cattle towns. Someone who had taught her to read land surveys and calculate angles when other fathers were teaching their daughters only needlework and household management. He had wanted her to attend a teaching college back east, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that could not be unmade, and she had been accepted to a prestigious institution in Boston that would have taken her far from the dangers of frontier territory. But she had delayed her departure to help him with one final surveying project, intrigued by his excitement over the disputed land claims, and wanting to spend more time learning his craft before she left for a world that had no use for such knowledge in women. That delay haunted her now, the ghost of a choice that seemed wise at the time but had led directly to this nightmare of violence and fear. If I had left when I was supposed to, she said quietly, none of this would have happened. Tommy would be Steve, and our father might still be alive instead of disappeared into whatever fate Dutch Carmichael arranged for him. Cassidy felt those words cut deep into places she had tried to seal off, and before she could stop herself she was telling them about James and Emma, about the raiders and the 2 years of futile searching, about learning that some losses could not be recovered no matter how hard you fought or how far you travelled. Sarah's arms tightened around Cassidy's waist in a gesture of understanding that needed no words, and Cassidy realised this young woman grasped the specific quality of guilt that came from surviving when others did not, from making choices that seemed reasonable until hindsight revealed them as the moment everything went wrong. Tommy's small voice cut through the heavy silence from where he rode behind them, asking a question that caught Cassidy completely unprepared. "Will you stay with us after this is over?" he asked, his tone carrying the careful hope of someone who had learned not to expect good things, but could not quite stop wanting them. The question hung in the air between one hoofbeat and the next, and Cassidy realised with a start that she had not thought beyond survival, had not considered what came after they retrieved the maps or faced down Dutch or any of the immediate dangers that filled her planning. They reached the derelict Walsh homestead, as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the abandoned buildings in shades of orange and red that made the weathered wood look almost alive despite years of neglect and decay. The well stood in what had once been the centre of the yard, its stone rim crumbling and overgrown with wild grass that spoke of seasons passing without human care, and the wooden cover had rotted through in places that revealed darkness below. Sarah approached it with trembling hands, pulling away the vegetation and broken boards until the opening stood clear, and when she dropped a pebble into the depths, the silence that followed told them the water had long since dried up or sunk deeper than sound could reach. Tommy volunteered before anyone could suggest it, his small voice steady as he said he was lightest, and could fit through spaces that adults could not. And Cassidy saw in his eyes the determination of someone who needed to prove himself useful after feeling helpless for too long. They fashioned a harness from rope and lowered him slowly into the darkness, while Sarah called down instructions to be careful and watch for loose stones, and Cassidy held the rope with hands that remembered doing the same thing for Emma when she wanted to climb trees too tall for her small body. Tommy's voice echoed up from below, reporting that he could see a hollow carved into the stone wall about 20 feet down, and moments later he called for them to pull him up with excitement vibrating through every word. The waterproof leather case he brought to the surface was exactly the kind that surveyors used to protect their most important documents, and when Sarah opened it with shaking fingers, they found everything her father had promised and more. The survey maps were masterworks of precision, showing every detail of the disputed land, including the massive silver vein that ran through bedrock like a river of potential wealth, and the assay reports confirmed deposits rich enough to make whoever controlled them wealthy beyond the dreams of ordinary people. The legal documents proved that Henry Walsh had filed his claim months before the Carmichael brothers submitted their fraudulent papers, establishing beyond question who held legitimate rights to the land and its riches. But it was the letter that made Sarah's composure finally break, her father's careful handwriting explaining that he had gone to the territorial capital to file official complaints against the Carmichaels, but feared he would not survive the journey or the confrontation that would follow. He instructed Sarah to take Tommy to their aunt in Colorado if he failed to return, to use these documents to prove their claim once she was safely beyond the reach of men who would kill to protect their illegal operations. The discovery gave them everything they needed to win, but it also confirmed what Sarah had been trying not to believe, that her father had known he was riding toward his own death and had done it anyway to give his children a chance at justice and survival. The sound of horses approaching from multiple directions made Cassidy's blood run cold, and she realised with sick certainty that May's diversion had failed, or perhaps had never been believed in the first place by men who made their living from tracking and hunting human prey. Dutch Carmichael appeared first from the tree line to the east, sitting tall in his saddle, with a confidence that spoke of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for his opponents to acknowledge the fact. And behind him came 5 more riders who spread out in a loose circle that encompassed the entire homestead with practiced efficiency. "We have been watching this property since yesterday morning," Dutch called out, his voice carrying easily across the open ground between them. "Figured if the girl knew where her daddy hid his papers, she would come running here eventually, and sure enough, here you all are like rabbits hopping straight into the trap." Cassidy positioned herself between the children and the nearest rider, her hand on her Colt, but knowing that drawing against 6 men would be suicide that accomplished nothing except getting them all killed faster. Dutch dismounted slowly and walked forward until he stood just beyond comfortable shooting range, and his scarred face showed satisfaction mixed with something darker that promised violence regardless of how this ended. "Your father was a persistent man," he said to Sarah, his tone almost conversational. "Rode all the way to the territorial capital 2 weeks ago thinking he could file complaints and bring the law down on us. But accidents happen on long lonely roads and bodies disappear into ravines where nobody thinks to look." The casual admission of murder hit Sarah like a physical blow, and Cassidy felt the young woman sag against her, as confirmation of her worst fears became undeniable reality. Dutch continued speaking with the patience of someone explaining simple facts to children, saying he wanted the documents they had retrieved from the well, and in exchange he would make their deaths quick rather than drawn out like Sarah's interrogation in the barn. They were surrounded with no cover and no realistic chance of fighting their way clear. 6 armed men against 1 woman, an injured girl barely recovered from torture, and a 9-year-old boy who should never have to face what was coming. Dutch gave them until dawn to think it over and decide whether they wanted to die defiant or cooperative. Then he rode back to establish a proper perimeter while his men settled in for a night of watching every possible escape route. As darkness fell and the campfires of their besiegers glowed like eyes in the night, Cassidy explored the abandoned house with desperate attention and found what she was looking for in the old root cellar, a space dug deep into the earth with walls of packed dirt that might be soft enough to tunnel through toward the creek bed she remembered running about 50 yards to the north. The plan was desperate and the odds of success minimal, but staying meant certain death while tunneling at least offered the slim chance of reaching May Thornton's ranch where they might hold out long enough for help to arrive. They worked through the long night in the root cellar, with fingers that bled and backs that screamed in protest, using rusted tools found in the abandoned house to dig through the back wall where decades of moisture had softened the packed earth into something that yielded grudgingly to their desperate efforts. The tunnel grew inch by painful inch, while above them Dutch's men maintained their watch, campfire light occasionally visible through cracks in the floorboards, and every scrape of the shovel sounded impossibly loud in the confined darkness despite Cassidy's efforts to muffle the noise with old burlap sacks. Tommy squeezed through first when the opening finally reached the creek bed, his small body disappearing into the narrow passage with a courage that made Cassidy's heart ache, and moments later his whispered all clear came back through the tunnel. Sarah went next, her larger frame barely fitting through the constricted space, and Cassidy heard her grunt with pain as the rough earth scraped against wounds still healing from the rope burns and beatings. Cassidy came last, pulling dirt back into place behind her to disguise their escape route for as long as possible. And when she finally emerged into the pre-dawn darkness near the creek, covered in mud and gasping for air, she allowed herself one moment of hope that they might actually survive this. That hope died when movement upstream caught her eye, and she recognized one of Dutch's men, a lean tracker named Cole, who had a reputation for finding what others missed, and his eyes locked onto their position with the certainty of someone who had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. The chase that followed was desperate and chaotic through the creek bed where water-smoothed rocks threatened to turn ankles and dense brush along the banks offered concealment but slowed their flight. And Cassidy could hear Cole gaining ground behind them with the steady pace of someone who knew his prey was tiring. She positioned Sarah and Tommy behind a tumble of boulders that would provide cover from gunfire, then turned to face Cole alone with her Colt drawn and her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough to make her dizzy. The tracker came around the bend with his rifle raised, but Cassidy fired first, her shot going wide as mud from the tunnel clogged the mechanism and caused the cylinder to jam halfway through its rotation. Cole closed the distance with frightening speed, and they came together in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence, the kind of fighting that had no rules or honor, only survival measured in heartbeats and the wet sound of steel finding flesh. Cassidy's knife came from her boot in a practiced motion that had saved her life before, and she drove it upward, under Cole's ribs with all her remaining strength, feeling his blood hot on her hands as he fell. But his own blade had found her as well, opening a deep gash across her ribs that burned like fire and bled in a way that told her the wound was serious, possibly mortal if she could not get it treated soon. Sarah demonstrated a strength that surprised even herself as she half lifted and half dragged Cassidy onto the horse after their desperate escape through the tunnel and the brutal fight with the tracker that had left Cassidy bleeding from a deep knife wound across her ribs. The wound was bad enough that Cassidy kept fading in and out of awareness during the hard ride toward May Thornton's ranch, her vision swimming with dark spots and her hands unable to maintain proper grip on the reins, leaving Sarah to guide both horses, while Tommy rode pressed against and her back. They arrived mid-morning to find May's ranch transformed into something resembling a military fortification, and what made Cassidy's fevered mind struggle to process the scene was that every figure she could see was a woman. May had assembled a small group of neighbouring women, all widows or women running their own spreads, all armed with rifles and shotguns and expressions that spoke of anger held in check for far too long. There was Ruth Blackwood, whose husband had been run off his claim by the Carmichaels 3 years prior, and Margaret Chen, who had lost her brother to a suspicious accident after he refused to sell his water rights, and at least 6 others whose faces told similar stories of loss and fury at men who terrorized the territory with impunity. May helped Sarah get Cassidy down from the horse and into the main house where capable hands stripped away her blood-soaked shirt and began cleaning the wound with whiskey and hot water, while Cassidy tried not to scream. The ranch was already being surrounded, May explained in a voice that cut through Cassidy's pain-induced fog, Dutch and his remaining men having tracked them here within the hour. But she had sent her fastest rider to the territorial marshal 2 days previous and expected help to arrive within 48 hours if they could hold out that long. The women took up defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of people who had been preparing for this confrontation for months or years. And through the window, Cassidy could see Dutch's gang establishing their own perimeter in a siege that would test whether justice could arrive before violence claimed more victims. The fever took hold as infection from the knife wound spread through Cassidy's body, and she drifted in and out of consciousness, while Sarah sat beside her bed bathing her forehead with cool cloths. In her delirium, Cassidy saw Emma's face as clearly as if 5 years had never passed, heard her daughter calling for help that never came, and she reached out with hands that grasped only empty air. She whispered apologies to a ghost and made promises to Sarah and Tommy that she feared she would not live to keep, haunted by the terrible possibility that after everything they had survived together, she would fail these children the same way she had failed her own. Dutch sent a messenger under white flag on the second morning of the siege, a young man barely out of boyhood who looked uncomfortable delivering threats from men old enough to know better, and his message was simple enough that May did not even let him finish before spitting her refusal into the dirt at his feet. Surrender the maps and the children and the women would be spared, Dutch promised, as if his word meant anything to people who had watched him terrorize the territory for years without consequence or remorse. May's answer was to raise her rifle and suggest the messenger return to his employer before she forgot about respecting white flags, and the young man rode back fast enough to raise dust that hung in the still morning air. But that evening, as Cassidy thrashed in fever dreams and the other women maintained their watch, Sarah made a decision that she shared with no one, until morning light revealed her resolve in features that had aged years in just days. She would meet Dutch alone in the open ground between the ranch and his position, she announced, and she would offer him a deal that might save lives even if it cost her everything. She had made copies of the survey maps during the night using paper and pencil borrowed from May, careful reproductions that showed the silver deposits but lacked the legal documentation that proved ownership, and she would give Dutch these copies while keeping the originals and claim papers that could still bring justice if she did not survive the meeting. May argued against it with language that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush, and the other women added their protests. But Sarah's mind was set with the immovable quality of someone who had finally found solid ground after days of being swept along by forces beyond her control. Cassidy, barely conscious and burning with fever, heard Sarah's plan through the haze and tried to rise from the bed where infection had pinned her, begging in a voice raw with desperation for Sarah not to go, not to throw away her life for people who were already dying anyway. But Sarah knelt beside the bed and took Cassidy's hot hand in both of hers, saying she had spent 3 days watching this stranger sacrifice everything for children she had never met, and she would not let another person die for her family when she had the power to stop it. Tommy was distraught beyond words. Clinging to his sister with the desperate strength of someone watching their last anchor being torn away, but Sarah kissed his head and whispered promises she hoped she could keep, then walked out into the morning light carrying the copied documents and nothing else. No weapon and no protection, except the hope that even men like Dutch Carmichael might honour a deal that gave them what they wanted. She crossed the open ground between the ranch house and Dutch's position with steps that never faltered despite the terror that must have been screaming through every nerve, and watching from the window, May muttered a prayer to a god she had long since stopped believing in, while the other women held their rifles ready and waited to see if courage alone could stand against the kind of evil that had no conscience to appeal to. Dutch rode forward to meet Sarah in the clearing with a smile that never reached his cold eyes, and from her position at the ranch window, May could see the way his hand rested on his gun belt in a manner that suggested violence was always his preferred conclusion regardless of what deals might be offered. Sarah stood alone in the open ground between the two armed camps, the copied maps clutched in her hands, and she began speaking terms that Dutch pretended to consider, while his men shifted positions in ways that suggested they were preparing to storm the ranch the moment their leader gave the signal. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from the east made every head turn, and what appeared over the ridge was salvation in the form of the territorial marshal and a dozen deputies riding hard with badges glinting in the morning sun and rifles ready across their saddles. May's messenger had reached them a day earlier than expected, and the marshal had ridden through the night, understanding that delay meant death for innocent people facing down the most dangerous gang in 3 territories. Dutch's face went white as he realized his careful siege had transformed into a trap with witnesses everywhere, legal authority present in force, and the very documents that proved his guilt and Henry Walsh's murder sitting in plain view for all to see. The deputies spread out in a wide arc that encompassed both Dutch's men and the ranch house, effectively ending the standoff before it could escalate further, and the marshal called out for all parties to lay down their weapons and prepare to give statements. But Dutch Carmichael had built an empire on violence and saw no reason to let law interfere with his final act of revenge, and his hand dropped to his pistol as he spun towards Sarah with murder written clear across his scarred features. The shot that stopped him came not from the deputies or May's assembled women, but from the ranch house porch where Cassidy had dragged herself upright against a support post, her body shaking with fever, and her vision swimming with dark spots that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The distance was 150 yards, with wind gusting hard enough to move prairie grass in visible waves, and Cassidy's hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the Colt steady. But years of practice and desperate necessity guided that bullet across the space between them to strike Dutch's gun hand and send his weapon spinning into the dirt. The deputies moved in fast to secure Dutch and his entire gang, while Sarah stood frozen in shock at how close death had come. And then she was running back toward the ranch house, where Tommy burst through the door and crashed into her arms with enough force to nearly knock them both down, his tears soaking into her dress while she held him and whispered that they were safe now, finally safe. Cassidy recovered slowly at May's ranch over the following weeks, her body fighting the infection with stubborn determination, while May sat vigil beside her bed with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd been given a second chance at redemption and refused to waste it. The two women talked during those long days of healing, working through the old accusations and misunderstandings that had kept them apart, and they discovered beneath the years of avoidance a genuine respect and the beginnings of real friendship built on shared experiences of loss and survival in country that tested everyone who tried to make a life there. The silver claim was validated by territorial authorities once Dutch Carmichael and his gang faced trial for murder and fraud, and the documents Henry Walsh had so carefully preserved proved beyond question that Sarah and Tommy were the legitimate heirs to wealth that exceeded anything their father could have imagined when he first started surveying that disputed land. But Sarah made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself, selling the claim to a reputable mining company out of Denver for enough money to live comfortably, without the burden of managing an operation that would consume her life and keep her bound to the very violence that had nearly destroyed her family. She used part of the proceeds to buy the property adjacent to Cassidy's ranch, explaining that her father's final letter had included a request she had not shared with anyone until the legal matters were settled, that she ensure Tommy grew up somewhere safe with people who would protect him and teach him to be strong without becoming hard. Sarah had witnessed Cassidy's fierce love and willingness to sacrifice everything for children she barely knew, and she understood with absolute certainty that she had found the place her father wanted for them. The three of them now ran their combined ranches together in a partnership that worked better than any of them had dared hope, with Sarah teaching at the new schoolhouse 3 days a week and spending the rest of her time managing the business side of their operation, while Tommy learned to work cattle under Cassidy's patient instruction and grew stronger and more confident with each passing week. May visited every Sunday without fail, bringing food and gossip and the steady presence of someone who had become family in all the ways that mattered, and the four of them would sit on the expanded porch watching the sun set over the land they had fought to keep and protect. Cassidy realized during those quiet evenings that the family she had lost 5 years ago had been replaced by one she had chosen through sacrifice and struggle, and that sometimes the children who save you are the very ones you try desperately to save first, their need calling forth strength you did not know you possessed, and their survival giving meaning to pain that might otherwise have destroyed you completely.